It was a quiet afternoon in the Arizona desert, 1944. The wind carried fine dust across the barbed wire fences of a U.S. internment camp where dozens of Japanese women sat beneath the pale sun, their eyes tracing the distant horizon. They were nurses, secretaries, wives of officers, once proud symbols of the empire, now prisoners of war on foreign soil. Their uniforms were faded, their sandals worn thin. Yet something new had arrived that morning, a wooden crate stamped with red letters they couldn't read. When an American guard popped the top and handed out glass bottles filled with a dark liquid that hissed when opened, the women froze. The sound, the fizz, the sparkle, felt alive. One woman whispered that it must be a divine tonic, perhaps medicine from the Americans' gods. Another bowed slightly before taking her first sip, her reflection trembling in the glass. The sweetness burned. It was unlike anything they had ever tasted. A strange, electric flavor that filled the camp with murmurs and awe. They called it a sacred elixir. None of them yet knew it had a name, Coca-Cola, and it would soon rewrite their idea of the enemy. Before that afternoon in the desert, their world had already collapsed. Most of these women had come from islands whose names were whispered in casualty reports: Saipan, Guam, the Philippines. Some had been captured in field hospitals after surrendering with wounded soldiers. Others were civilian nurses and clerks caught when American forces overran Japanese garrisons. They were not trained for captivity. In the code of their homeland, surrender meant shame worse than death. Yet the war's tide was unstoppable, and survival carried its own quiet defiance. By 1944, America's prisoner of war system stretched from Hawaii to the heartland. The United States held more than 400,000 enemy POWs, mostly Germans and Italians, but a small secret number of Japanese prisoners as well. Among them were about 700 Japanese women scattered across a few guarded compounds run by the War Department and supervised by the Red Cross. They were treated under the Geneva Convention, though suspicion on both sides never fully eased. When the transport trucks first rolled through the camp gates in Arizona, the landscape must have felt otherworldly. Dry mesas, cottonwood shadows, and an empty horizon that smelled of sun-baked dust, a far cry from the lush islands they had known. The American guards wore khaki and mirrored sunglasses. Their language was a stream of hard consonants. The women, wrapped in simple cotton uniforms, kept their heads low and moved in quiet rows. At first, silence ruled the compound. The women avoided eye contact, bowing slightly to one another in the old manner. To them, the Americans were giants, loud, impulsive, impossible to read. They believed these captors were ruthless. Propaganda had shown them caricatures of monsters with metal claws and glowing eyes. Now they saw men laughing over cigarettes, sharing jokes about baseball, calling each other buddy. It was confusing. Meals were another shock. Instead of rice and miso, they were given bread, beans, and something called corned beef. To the Japanese palate, it was alien food, salty, heavy, without the fragrance of home. Yet the Americans seemed proud of it. Sometimes the guards tried to show kindness. An extra apple, a smile, a few awkward words of Japanese learned from a pocket phrasebook. But pride and fear ran deep. Many women refused gifts, believing them to be traps to test loyalty. Over time, a strange coexistence formed. The camp's daily rhythm, roll call, chores, evening curfew, flattened the days into routine. Letters were censored but still allowed. Small parcels arrived through the Red Cross. The Americans encouraged light labor, sewing uniforms, tending vegetable plots, caring for chickens. The women worked methodically, speaking little. At night, they wrote haiku on scraps of paper, describing the color of the desert sky or the cry of trains in the distance. The cultural distance was more profound than any fence. Most had been raised in a nation that worshipped the emperor as divine, where even Western goods were rare symbols of decadence. To them, America was a dreamlike world, dangerous, abundant, and spiritually hollow. Yet within the camp, that myth began to crack. They saw soldiers reading letters from wives, polishing boots, humming tunes on small radios. The Americans had their own rituals, their own faith, their own hunger for something beyond war. Then came the small deliveries from nearby towns, crates of soap, tins of condensed milk, bars of chocolate, and, once in a while, the glass bottles that would start a legend. Coca-Cola had become a military icon, a portable taste of home carried from Normandy to New Guinea. The U.S. Army called it the pause that refreshes, building bottling plants across war zones so every soldier could have one. For the American ants, it was nothing more than a soda. For the Japanese women who had never seen such a thing, it looked like bottled magic. A dark, sparkling liquid in elegant glass, its red label marked with foreign symbols. When the first crate arrived, no one explained what it was. The guards, amused, offered bottles during a hot afternoon. The women accepted them carefully as though holding a relic. The faint hiss from the cap startled them. The rising bubbles glittered like mercury in the sun. To minds shaped by Shinto reverence for nature's spirits, even simple fizz could feel alive. One woman whispered that it might be kami no mizu, water of the gods. Another believed it was medicine from American doctors meant to restore strength. And so a soft myth began to form behind the wire. In that moment of misunderstanding lay something deeper, the first fragile bridge between two worlds that had only known each other through hatred. The drink was sweet, strange, and entirely ordinary. Yet to these prisoners it shimmered with wonder, and wonder even in captivity could be dangerous. The misunderstanding did not end that day. It grew quietly, almost tenderly, into a symbol that neither side intended. Inside the camp, Coca-Cola became a whispered legend. Bottles were rare and carefully shared. The women passed them around, each taking a single sip before setting them in sunlight, watching the bubbles fade like spirits leaving the body. Some poured the remaining drops onto the dry ground, a small ritual offering to ancestors they believed might be watching. They called it kami no bi, sacred firewater. To them, it seemed alive, something beyond mere human invention. The Americans, unaware of the reverence forming around it, saw only curiosity. To a nation steeped in advertising and abundance, Coca-Cola represented home, normalcy, and victory. The slogan, "It's the real thing," echoed across billboards and army camps. Soldiers drank it in trenches, on supply ships, and in bombed-out cities, a comfort that followed them everywhere. To the guards, offering a bottle to prisoners was a gesture of civility, almost a joke, a reminder that even enemies could share something simple and human. But to the Japanese women, raised in a culture built on hierarchy and ritual purity, every taste carried meaning. They had grown up in a world where tea was sacred, water was purified, and the act of drinking itself followed ceremony. To gulp, to slurp, to waste, these were breaches of grace. When they saw Americans drink straight from bottles, laughing as they wiped their mouths, it was both shocking and fascinating. How could people so casual in behavior defeat the disciplined sons of the emperor? This question lingered quietly through the months. Many of the women had once believed Japan was invincible, its spirit pure, its enemies weak and indulgent. Yet here they saw strength and ease, a kind of calm confidence that no propaganda had prepared them for. The Americans were not divine, but neither were they demons. They were people with machines, humor, and an endless supply of things that made life sweet. Among the prisoners, subtle shifts began to appear. Some women, secretly curious, began learning English words from the labels on cans and bottles. Sugar, company, Atlanta, Georgia. The names sounded exotic, distant, and oddly comforting. They began sketching the Coca-Cola logo on scraps of cardboard, fascinated by its flowing script. One nurse, who had once served near Manila, wrote in her hidden diary that the enemy's drink carries a spell that makes them smile in war. Outside the fences, America itself was changing. Wartime production had flooded the nation with industry, and with it came a strange cultural export: taste, branding, leisure. The Coca-Cola Company, with government approval, built plants from Algiers to Brisbane to ensure a bottle in every soldier's hand. The drink became more than refreshment, it became propaganda in liquid form. The same bottle that comforted GIs was, unknowingly, performing soft diplomacy across the globe, showing the enemy that American life was not just power, but pleasure. Inside the camp, that pleasure looked like mystery. Some of the women began to trade chores for empty bottles, polishing them and lining them up along their bunks. The glass gleamed like captured starlight in the desert evenings. They didn't understand why the Americans laughed, why they offered soda so freely, but they could feel something shift, a slow erosion of fear. The enemy no longer seemed invincible in cruelty, but incomprehensible in generosity. Still, shame lingered. Every act of curiosity risked dishonor. To question Japan's teachings, even privately, was to betray a lifetime of belief. Many wrestled with guilt at feeling gratitude toward captors. And yet, when the next shipment of crates arrived, they could not resist. The bottles hissed, the bubbles danced, and the camp filled again with the strange hum of fascination. In time, the guards noticed. One corporal from Texas began jokingly calling it holy water. Another began keeping the bottles locked until inspection was over. What had begun as a harmless cultural exchange now bordered on the surreal, a soft misunderstanding that revealed just how vast the gulf between two civilizations could be. But beyond misunderstanding lay connection. The sweetness of that drink, fleeting, unnecessary, purely human, cut through the noise of war. The women did not yet know that the same Coca-Cola that mystified them was being served to prisoners in Germany, to workers in London, to pilots on Saipan. Across the world, it was teaching the same quiet lesson, that power sometimes wore the face of simplicity, and beneath the Arizona sun, behind wire and watchtowers, that lesson was beginning to take root, one sip at a time. To understand what that single drink meant, one must see it from every side, human, psychological, and symbolic. Each angle reveals how a simple bottle of soda became an unlikely mirror of war, identities. For the first time since capture, others cried quietly, unable to explain why. That reaction, small, sincere, unguarded, was more powerful than any weapon the war had shown them. To the American guards, Coca-Cola was a simple comfort, a pause in the desert heat, a way to break monotony. But for the Japanese women, every gesture of kindness was filtered through a lifetime of indoctrination. They had been told the Americans were savages, that women would be violated, that honor would vanish the moment they surrendered. Yet the guards smiled, spoke gently, and shared food and drink. The dissonance was overwhelming. Psychologists later studying prisoner behavior noted that cultural shocks like these often caused a subtle identity fracture, a clash between ingrained belief and lived reality. For these women, Coca-Cola became the first symbol of that fracture. It was American, yet harmless, foreign, yet inviting. The more they saw the guards enjoying it casually, the more the boundaries blurred. If the enemy could laugh, could share, could taste sweetness amid war, what else about them had been wrong? In interviews conducted decades later, former Japanese internees recalled that the drink felt alive, forbidden, almost holy. One woman remembered thinking, if they can make something so joyful, perhaps they are not demons after all. That realization, fragile, dangerous, quietly transformative, began reshaping perceptions within the camp. The war had been fought to preserve pride, but the human heart could not survive on pride alone. To America, Coca-Cola had long been more than a drink. It was a weapon of influence. In 1943, General Eisenhower himself requested shipments for troops in North Africa, insisting that every man in uniform should have a bottle within reach. The company built portable bottling plants across battlefronts, producing billions of servings for soldiers. It became a cultural export disguised as comfort, a symbol of democracy's abundance against totalitarian austerity. When the Japanese women in captivity held that same bottle, they were unknowingly holding America's most successful form of propaganda. Not a leaflet, not a speech, but a taste. The kind of power that did not need to be explained or translated. It spoke directly to instinct. Sweetness was a luxury in wartime Japan. Sugar was rationed, candy nearly extinct. So to taste sugar in captivity was a paradox, an enemy's gift that defied the logic of hate. The women whispered about it for weeks. They described the bottle as smooth, perfect, almost divine in shape. Some believed it contained alcohol or secret medicine. Others began calling it America's blood because of its deep color and the reverence with which soldiers treated it. The camp's chaplain once laughed when told of the nickname, but later admitted he found it oddly poetic, a communion of sorts between two worlds at war. In a sense, Coca-Cola became a silent missionary, not of faith, but of perception. The same way Western missionaries once brought crosses and Bibles, the American soldier brought soda, and with it, a new kind of gospel: pleasure, normalcy, optimism. The women didn't understand the message consciously, but they could feel its warmth. As the days turned into months, the myth grew. The women began saving the empty bottles as charms, believing they carried luck. One nurse tied a strip of red cloth around hers, saying it reminded her of the rising sun, her home, refracted through glass. In the evenings, she would place it near her pillow, the faint reflection of moonlight through the bottle casting tiny rings on the wall. To her, it was both enemy and comfort. It was easy to dismiss such gestures as superstition, Yet they carried immense psychological weight. In a world where freedom was gone, belief, even in something absurd, became a form of survival. Coca-Cola was no longer just a drink. It was an idea that something good could exist amid humiliation, that even prisoners could find beauty in defeat. And through that quiet revelation, something began to change not only in the camp, but within the guards themselves. They saw respect in the prisoners' restraint, gentleness in their rituals, curiosity instead of hatred. Small gestures replaced suspicion. Shared humanity began to seep through barbed wire, and it all began with the fizz of a bottle opened under the desert sun. Long before the war, Japan's culture had been built on the beauty of restraint, quiet gestures, muted colors, and meaning hidden beneath formality. Simplicity was elegance, and moderation was virtue. Yet the Americans seemed to celebrate the opposite. Their world was loud, bright, impulsive. Their music blared from radios, their laughter echoed freely, and even their drinks hissed and sparkled. Coca-Cola embodied everything alien to Japanese sensibilities, modernity in a bottle. To the women behind the fence, that contrast was mesmerizing. The Western notion of joy was immediate, physical, and unashamed. In their homeland, happiness was something refined and subdued. A smile meant control, not indulgence. And yet, when they watched American soldiers gulp down bottles of Coke after long guard shifts, tossing the empties into bins and belching with satisfaction, they saw a kind of liberation, the freedom to be ordinary. Some of the women began to quietly mimic the guards' habits, sipping more boldly, trying to understand the American rhythm. Others recoiled, fearing the erosion of identity. In that small clash over a drink, centuries of cultural isolation met the modern world. The soda, fizzy, sweet, and Western, became a bridge and a warning at once. What neither side realized was that Coca-Cola's presence in the camp was no accident. During the war, the U.S. government recognized the brand's psychological power. To the home front, it symbolized morale. To soldiers, it represented loyalty and belonging. Coca-Cola executives even pledged to sell every bottle to the military at cost, ensuring that no soldier would be without it. Behind the scenes, Allied propaganda units understood its deeper effect, how simple pleasures could soften perception. The beverage became an unofficial ambassador. In liberated Europe, civilians saw it as proof of abundance. In occupied Japan later, it became a token of peace and prosperity. The idea was subtle but revolutionary. Instead of forcing ideals through speeches, America let its lifestyle speak through consumption. Inside the Arizona camp, that strategy worked without intention. The women's reverence for the drink made the guards laugh, but it also humanized the captives in their eyes. They were no longer faceless enemies. They were women capable of awe, confusion, and curiosity, emotions common to all. This humanization was a quiet victory for both sides. No leaflet could have achieved what that bottle did. Historians later noted that Coca-Cola's presence during the war marked the beginning of soft power, the art of influence through culture rather than coercion. The prisoner's fascination, though innocent, was part of a larger transformation. It showed that victory was not only measured in battles won, but in hearts subtly turned by comfort, color, and taste. War often strips morality to its bones, survival, obedience, revenge. Yet within that desert camp, morality took on a different face. The guards could have mocked or punished the women's strange reverence for a drink, but they didn't. Many respected it, sensing its purity. The prisoners could have clung to hatred, yet curiosity slowly replaced contempt. In that fragile balance, both sides glimpsed humanity. There was irony in it all. A drink born of capitalism, delivered through war, became a vessel for compassion. To the women, it offered temporary escape from humiliation. To the guards, it offered a way to see the enemy as people again. Each side gave the other something unintended, dignity without words. Later, when the women were released and repatriated to a defeated Japan, many carried memories of that soda as something sacred, not because it was divine, but because it represented peace. For them, it was the first thing that hadn't come from orders or ideology. It came from human kindness. Years afterward, when Coca-Cola finally entered Japan officially during the U.S. occupation, it was met not with suspicion but with nostalgia. Those who had once been prisoners saw it again in stores and smiled. The elixir of the enemy had become the drink of the new Japan, open, curious, unafraid. Few remembered the origins of that change, but somewhere in the desert, the first taste had already rewritten the story. That is how one misunderstanding, born from sweetness, bubbles, and silence, became a quiet moral parable of war, that even enemies can share wonder before they share words. The summer of 1945, the desert had grown even hotter. The war in the Pacific was reaching its final brutal crescendo. Okinawa was lost, Tokyo was burning, and rumors of invasion whispered through the camp like desert wind. Yet behind the barbed wire, time moved differently. The prisoners had grown accustomed to the rhythm of captivity. The same chores, the same food, the same faces. Only the occasional arrival of trucks broke the monotony. One morning, a shipment arrived carrying supplies for the guards. The prisoners watched, as always, from a distance. Wooden crates, canvas sacks, and then stacked in neat rows the familiar red logos, Coca-Cola. The guards cheered quietly, hauling the cases into storage. The women glanced at each other, their eyes carried the same unspoken thought. For weeks they had run out of bottles, and many had whispered that the divine drink had vanished forever. That afternoon, the guards decided to share a few bottles again. Perhaps it was boredom, perhaps a smile, ill gesture of mercy. They passed the drinks through the wire, cold and beaded with condensation. The women bowed politely, as they always did, accepting them with reverence. But this time, something unexpected happened. One of the younger women, a nurse from Nagasaki named Aiko, tilted her head curiously. She had studied chemistry before the war, and the fizzing sound had long intrigued her. As the others murmured softly, she whispered to herself, "It smells of caramel, not medicine." Holding the bottle against the sunlight, she noticed its transparency. No sediment, no herbs, no spiritual markings. Just a clear brown liquid with bubbles rising and bursting like tiny glass beads. Iko took a sip, then another, and suddenly frowned. The sweetness was sharp, artificial, clinging to her tongue. She coughed lightly and looked up at the guard, who chuckled. "Just soda," he said in broken Japanese. "Drink. Soda pop?" The words hung in the air. Soda pop. Not holy water, not sacred elixir, just a drink. Aiko blinked, translating the phrase in her mind, then smiled faintly. She turned to the women beside her and repeated, "Just soda." For a moment there was silence. Then one of them laughed, a deep, unrestrained laugh that startled even the guards. Another followed, then another, until the camp erupted into laughter that carried across the barren field. For months they had treated this liquid as divine, guarding empty bottles as relics. And now they learned it was nothing more than sugared water with bubbles. The realization was absurd and liberating at once. It shattered a wall of reverence and, with it, the invisible distance between captor and captive. The guards laughed too, wiping sweat from their foreheads, unsure what exactly they were laughing at. Perhaps the joy of the moment, perhaps the absurdity of war itself. The women began passing bottles freely among themselves, no longer bowing or whispering prayers. One poured a bit into her hand and playfully splashed it on another's arm. The guard laughed again, shouting, "No miracle, only Coke!" It was, in its own way, a ceremony, not of faith, but of awakening. For the first time, both sides stood on the same ground, connected by something so trivial and human that all ideologies dissolved in the heat. The women were no longer mysterious figures behind wire. They were simply people tasting joy. Aiko later wrote in her post-war diary, "It was not sacred, but it made us free. We had given divinity to the ordinary. In learning the truth, we saw the Americans not as gods or devils, but as people, and that made us human again." From that day forward, the camp changed. The women began speaking more freely, practicing English words with the guards. The guards responded with patience, teaching them phrases like "good morning" and "thankin' you." The air between them softened. Even the desert seemed less cruel. The discovery that Coca-Cola was just soda had undone something deeper than a myth. It had undone the emotional armor both sides wore. The Americans realized how alien their world looked through the eyes of others. The Japanese women realized that understanding, not reverence or hatred, was the true bridge across cultures. It was a small revelation, unnoticed by generals or historians, yet it carried more meaning than many victories. A simple bottle of soda had done what diplomacy could not, turned enemies into witnesses of the same absurd truth, that beneath pride and propaganda, humanity survives through the ordinary. That laughter did not fade quickly. It lingered through the camp, echoing off the fences and barracks, softening the hard edges of everything that war had made brittle. For months, the prisoners had been defined by silence, silence of loss, of discipline, of distance. But in that moment of shared amusement, the desert no longer felt like exile. It felt fleetingly like a place where understanding had finally touched the ground. The guards didn't entirely grasp the significance of what had happened. To them, it was just a funny misunderstanding and a cultural quirk to tell stories about when they went home. But for the Japanese women, it was something far more profound. The myth of the sacred drink had not been foolishness. It had been a defense, a way to preserve dignity in a foreign world. When they realized the truth, it didn't humiliate them. It liberated them. The divine had become ordinary, and in that ordinariness, they rediscovered themselves. Iko, the nurse from Nagasaki, became a small bridge between the two worlds. She began teaching the other women English words written phonetically on scraps of brown paper. Soda, sweet, America. The guards, in turn, began using simple Japanese greetings. It was no longer prisoner and guard. It was Miss Aiko and Sergeant Tom. A new kind of respect emerged, not political, not formal, but human. Evening gatherings became gentler. Sometimes the guards allowed the prisoners to sit outside after dusk, watching the sky cool into violet and gold. The desert air smelled of sage and rusted metal. The women would hum old Japanese songs, and the guards listened quietly, their faces soft in the fading light. There were no orders in those moments, just the rare stillness that comes when war pauses to breathe. One night, a guard brought out a small hand-cranked phonograph. From its tin speaker came the crackling voice of Bing Crosby singing, "I'll Be Seeing You." The melody floated across the wire. Some of the women recognized the rhythm from radio propaganda they'd heard before the war. But now, the song was no longer the enemy's sound. It was simply music. Gentle, sentimental, human. One of them whispered, "Kirei na oto," beautiful sound. When the record ended, silence returned, but a softer silence, one filled with shared awareness. Aiko raised her empty Coca-Cola bottle, now cleaned and filled with water, and held it up to the moonlight. The glass refracted the glow into tiny, shimmering rings on the sand. The women called it moonfire. The guard smiled. It was no longer a relic of misunderstanding. It was a token of peace. Days later, a rumor reached the camp. Japan had surrendered. The empire was finished. The women sat motionless as the announcement was read in English, then translated. Some wept, others stared at the ground, lost between grief and relief. Their entire world, the one they had been raised to serve and die for, was gone. The guards, equally solemn, offered no celebration. They understood that victory felt hollow when the cost was so immense. That evening, one of the Americans quietly left a crate outside the women's barracks. Inside were a dozen bottles of Coca-Cola and the last ones in camp. A note was tucked under the lid, scrawled in uncertain handwriting, "For peace." The women did not treat it as ritual this time. They opened the bottles, poured them into tin cups, and drank together under the fading desert sun. Some smiled through tears. Aiko looked at the label once more, the looping white script that had once been unreadable, and whispered, "Not a god, just kindness." That night, they washed the bottles carefully, lined them on a wooden shelf, and left them there like quiet memorials. Each one caught the moonlight differently, glowing faintly in the darkness. To anyone else, it might have seemed trivial, a row of empty bottles in a dusty barrack. But to those women, it was a monument to something wordless. How humanity can slip through cracks even in captivity. How small things can outlive hatred. When the trucks came weeks later to take them to processing camps before repatriation, some women carried their bottles with them. One was confiscated by a guard who smiled and said gently, "Don't worry, you'll find more of these back home soon." He was right. Within a few years, Coca-Cola would appear in post-war Japan. Bright red trucks rolling through Tokyo streets, billboards rising beside temples and shrines. For those women who had once thought it divine, it no longer was. But they still smiled each time they saw the label. It was not the drink that mattered anymore, but the memory of how it had revealed a truth too simple for war to erase, that even when nations fight, people can still meet in the space between ignorance and laughter. That moment, when a myth turned to laughter and laughter turned to peace, marked the quiet turning point of their captivity. The war had taken everything from them, but it could not take that. When the war finally ended, the barbed wire that had defined their lives for years no longer carried meaning. The women were gathered under the white glare of the desert sun and told they would soon be sent home. Many did not cheer. Home to them was now an uncertain word. Japan had been bombed, its cities flattened, its emperor, once divine, now human. Families were gone, homes erased, the world reordered. The guards who once seemed distant now looked at them with quiet sympathy, aware that release did not mean relief. Before departure, the camp officers conducted one final inspection. Belongings were cataloged, boxes sealed, and forbidden items confiscated. But when one officer reached the women's quarters, he hesitated. There on the shelf stood the bottles, 12 gleaming relics washed clean, their red labels faintly faded by sunlight. He looked at them for a long time and then said, almost to himself, "Let them keep them." It was a small act of mercy, one no report would ever mention. The women left the camp in silence, their few possessions wrapped in cloth bundles. Some carried the bottles inside, wrapped carefully beside folded handkerchiefs and photographs. As the trucks rolled through the gates for the last time, a few glanced back at the watchtower. The guards raised their hands in farewell. For a moment, both sides seemed suspended, no longer enemies, not yet strangers again, just human beings who had shared something fragile and unforgettable in the desert. Their journey across the Pacific was long and uncertain. They boarded a U.S. transport ship bound for Yokohama, escorted by military personnel who treated them with measured respect. At night, the women gathered on deck, watching the black water shimmer under starlight. The ocean was vast, but it no longer felt hostile. They whispered to each other about the camp, about the guards, about the drink that had once seemed sacred. Someone joked softly that maybe the Americans had tricked them into worshipping sugar. They laughed, not bitterly, but fondly. When they finally saw Japan's coastline, their hearts tightened. The land was scarred. Bombed-out ruins stretched where cities once stood. Yokohama's port was a field of twisted metal and ash. The air carried the smell of charcoal and dust. There were no banners, no parades, only silence and the quiet footsteps of a defeated people. Yet amid the devastation, the women felt something new, not shame, but understanding. They had seen both sides of humanity, cruelty and compassion, destruction and tenderness. In the months that followed, life began to rebuild itself slowly and awkwardly. American occupation forces arrived with food, medicine, and cultural floodgates. Newspapers printed photographs of General MacArthur standing beside Emperor Hirohito, an image that stunned the world. To the women, it symbolized everything they had already learned in captivity, that the divine could become human and the human could be forgiven. For some of them, the bottles survived the years that followed. Aiko placed hers on a small wooden shelf in her home in Nagasaki, beside a vase of paper cranes. It was cracked at the rim, but she never threw it away. Each time she looked at it, she remembered the desert wind, the laughter, and the moment when pride gave way to peace. Her children would later ask why she kept it. She only said, "Because it taught me the truth." The truth she meant was simple, that what begins in misunderstanding can end in revelation. The Coca-Cola bottle had not been a miracle, but it had carried one inside it. The quiet miracle of empathy. It showed that even in the most divided world, two hands reaching for the same thing, even a soda, could become an act of reconciliation. And somewhere across oceans and memories, the echo of that laughter still lingered, a sound that outlived the war. When the occupation years began, the memory of captivity faded into silence, not out of shame, but because the world was busy rebuilding itself. Yet traces of that desert camp lingered in unexpected places. In 1946, the first Coca-Cola bottling plant opened in Tokyo under the supervision of the Allied forces. Trucks painted bright red rolled through the ruins of Ginza and Shibuya, handing out bottles to curious crowds. For many Japanese citizens, it was their first taste of America, sweet, cold, and utterly foreign. Among those who tasted it again were the former women POWs. Some recognized it instantly. The same hiss, the same sweetness, the same faint caramel aftertaste. But now, it no longer carried mystery, it carried memory. What had once been a symbol of surrender had become a token of survival. Aiko, now working as a nurse in Nagasaki, wrote in her diary that first winter, "When I drink it now, I see no gods, no enemies, only the day when we laughed." Japan changed quickly. Under American occupation, Western goods poured in. Canned food, chocolate, nylon stockings, jukeboxes. The Japanese public, starved for joy after years of war, embraced the new culture with hunger. Coca-Cola became more than a drink again. It became a symbol of rebirth. Its advertisements promised optimism in modern life, showing smiling women in bright dresses, a stark contrast to the gray austerity of wartime. Ironically, the same image that once bewildered prisoners now inspired a generation rebuilding from ashes. But for the women who had lived behind wire, that sweetness carried layers of meaning. They remembered the guards who shared it, the heat of the desert, the moment when laughter replaced fear. Some corresponded with former captors, exchanging letters of gratitude that crossed the Pacific through Red Cross channels. The war had made them enemies, but memory made them witnesses to something deeper, that kindness could exist even where orders forbade it. Historians studying POW experiences later noted that cultural misunderstandings often produced the most revealing truths. The Coca-Cola episode, rarely mentioned in official records, became an unspoken parable of the human side of war. It showed that conquest alone cannot erase curiosity and that even the defeated can find dignity in understanding. Aiko lived a quiet life. She married, raised children, and never spoke publicly about the camp. But every summer, when the heat became unbearable, she bought a bottle of Coca-Cola from a small store near her home. She would pour it into a glass, watch the bubbles rise, and sit by the window in silence. Her children thought it was just her favorite drink. She never corrected them. To her, each sip was a reminder of the day she discovered that divinity could live inside the ordinary, that peace was not a gift, but a realization. By the 1950s, Coca-Cola had become part of Japan's post-war miracle. Teenagers drank it while listening to jazz. Couples shared it on dates. Street vendors sold it near movie theaters showing American films. It was no longer foreign. It was part of the new rhythm of life. And yet, buried beneath that transformation lay the unseen origin. A few women in a desert camp who once thought it sacred, and who had unknowingly turned misunderstanding into a moment of connection. Time moved on. The old camp in Arizona was dismantled, its barracks repurposed or left to rot under the sun. The desert reclaimed the land, covering the past with sand and silence. Only fragments remained, a rusted gate hinge, a weathered signpost, the faint outline of a fence. Yet somewhere, in homes scattered across Japan, a few bottles survived. Glass polished clear, labels faded but intact. Relics of a strange faith born from captivity and ended in laughter. Those bottles, like their owners, had crossed the distance between enemy and ally, between shame and peace. They stood as quiet proof that even in the smallest things, a sip of sweetness, a moment of confusion, a shared laugh, history can bend toward understanding. History often remembers wars through battles, strategies, and surrender documents. But what truly endures are the smaller, quieter moments, those where the human heart breaks through the machinery of conflict. For the Japanese women who once believed Coca-Cola was a sacred elixir, that discovery was not about the drink at all. It was about the moment when fear gave way to curiosity, when reverence gave way to laughter, and when enemies became mirrors of the same humanity. In a world divided by propaganda, that misunderstanding became its own kind of revelation. It showed that people, stripped of uniforms and orders, can still meet each other in the ordinary. A bottle of soda, a trivial artifact of industrial America, became a vessel for something eternal, the human need to connect, to find meaning, even in captivity. Eiko's generation would later see their homeland transformed by the very culture they once viewed with suspicion. The Coca-Cola trucks rumbling through Tokyo's neon streets were not symbols of conquest, but of continuity, reminders that the sweetness of life had survived the bitterness of war. Those who had once knelt before the bottle now drank it freely, not as believers, but as participants in a shared future. The war ended long ago, yet its echoes remain not in monuments or medals, but in stories like these, where humility replaced hatred and laughter replaced fear. Behind every empire's fall and every nation's rise lies this universal truth. Humanity is fragile, but wonder is stronger than obedience. In the end, the sacred elixir was never sacred. It was just soda, carbonated water, sugar, and caramel. But within its bubbles floated something far greater, the simple, undeniable proof that understanding can begin anywhere, even in the hands of those once called enemies. And perhaps that is how peace truly begins. Not with treaties or speeches, but with a shared taste of something ordinary, something that reminds us that beneath flags, languages, and borders, we are still capable of awe. That single bottle of Coca-Cola, opened in a desert camp under the blazing sun of 1944, was not a miracle of faith or commerce. It was a miracle of perception. A reminder that even in war, the smallest sip can reveal the humanity we almost forget we share.